d'aver sofferto da colpi e ferite dopo l'atroci martiri.
Hi, welcome, and it's great to be here. It's great to have all of you here. As you guys know, if you've been, the ones of you who have been on the chat, let me know. I have a little sound problem here, an echo, and I don't care if it's only for me, but let me know if the sound is messed up on your end. Anyway, the Shroud of Turin show. I'm really excited about this. It's kind of almost kind of like a hopeless show to do because everything I look into opens up a whole nother sea of more things to look into. And very literally, I think one could easily do an entire 12-part series on just the Shroud of Turin. But it is a spectacular example of some scientific proof, so to speak. Thank you. Very clean sound. I had to take out my earpiece for that, so it doesn't distract me. But anyway, it's a fantastic example of physical, scientifically verified proof of the truth of the Catholic faith. There's none better, in fact. That's how I feel about all of them, though. I just had to clear the weeds away with that business about evolution. But since then, all the stuff, the Eucharistic miracles, the Tilm of Guadalupe, the Shroud of Turin. Come on, guys. This really is a red pill, blue pill situation. Let me start with a little quote from Chesterton that I've had before. I didn't believe in the Catholic Church because something pointed to it. I believed it because everything pointed to it. Amen. And that's the purpose of this series. So let me get started with the Shroud of Turin. Now, if you read the description under the YouTube announcement, you'll see that my special guest on this show is going to be Barrie Schwortz. Now, Barrie Schwortz is Jewish. What a name, Barrie Schwortz, right? And he was the scientific photographer chosen to document and photograph the Shroud in the 1978 Shroud Research Project. Usually the acronym is used STURP, S-T-U-R-P, which would be Shroud of Turin something University Research Project. I'm not sure what the U stands for. And anyway, he's become a pretty good friend. And a while ago, I talked to him over the phone, kind of interviewed him, asked him a bunch of questions. And that was without any video, though. So what I'm doing on today's show is I am going to play that kind of little taped exchange, stopping it frequently. In other words, playing a snippet from the tape, stopping it to talk about what he said, to show slides of what he said, and so forth, to illustrate it. Now, in the chat before the show, I saw that somebody said, I can't believe he's not already Christian. So let me just start with that. When I met him, we got off like a house on fire. And let me show you, actually, let me start with some pictures, show you why we got off like a house on fire. Now this is Barrie Schwortz today. He looks like a kind of overage
Well, I
hippie.
would just like to say what a great pleasure it was.
As am I, an overage
Roy,
hippie.
and I'm going to let the
And
audience
the
know
proof
that,
of that
when I first heard Roy, it was several days before I was
let me
coming
find
down
the
to
picture.
Florida there.
Here is a picture of Barrie Schwortz at the time of the Shroud of Turin research project. So in 1978, and he looks kind of hippie-ish or something. But oh my, okay, let me see if I can get this to work. Okay, and here is a picture of me at the time next to the picture of Barrie Schwortz. So you see that I think we look like we could be brothers or something. So anyway, we are, we come from the same world, and anyway, we really got on well together. And I had like a 4-hour conversation with him on our first real conversation. And of course, I was talking to him about my conversion. He was very familiar with my conversion. You'll hear that in a moment. As a matter of fact, let me play a little clip. Let me play this little clip first. Oh boy, I bet. Anyway, I hope I get the technology here to work. But let me play this little clip of from a conversation with Barrie Schwortz, and you'll see where I'm coming from.
Well, I would just like to say what a great pleasure it was to finally meet you, Roy, and I'm going to let the audience know that when I first heard from Roy, it was several days before I was coming down to Florida there, and as soon as I saw his name, I knew who he was because 4 of my Catholic friends over the last probably 4 or 5 years have sent me copies of Roy's book, Salvation is from the Jews. Hint, hint, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, from my Catholic friends. But I thought it was a wonderful opportunity to finally get to meet this man whose name I had known for so long. And so I just want to thank you for coming over to the university and spending 3 or 4 hours sitting there with me, just talking about our personal experiences and what got us to where we are today.
So obviously, that 3 or 4 hour conversation revolved around my conversion and his lack of conversion. And I'm convinced that God doesn't want him to become Catholic at this point. I don't want to sound heretical. But he's a much more powerful evangelizer for the truth of the Shroud of Turin as a Jew who sounds Jewish and looks Jewish and is Jewish. And his audiences are very often not Catholic. He goes to all kinds of Protestant churches and so forth, giving this presentation, proving the truth of the Shroud of Turin. If he entered the Catholic Church, he would be immediately dismissed out of hand by both Jews and by Protestants as having sold out, to the whore of Babylon and doing this for money or doing this to ingratiate himself with his new friends or something like that. As long as he's not Catholic, Jews have to take this a lot more seriously and Protestants have to take this a lot more seriously. So I gave up trying to convert him when I realized, or thought I realized, that he's exactly where God wants him to be. That's what I think. And in fact, he said, when I, asked him point blank, his response is, at this point in time, I don't feel like God is asking me to enter the Catholic Church. That's all he says. He doesn't say he doesn't believe in it or anything like that. So I think he's right about that. But this show is not about Barrie Schwortz or me. It's about the Shroud of Turin, so I better get on with it. Okay, so I will. Okay, so I'll just start playing his audio, and I'll stop it after a couple of minutes to show some slides of what he's been talking about. So here we go. If I can figure out how to do this. Okay, so I'll do this with him since he's kind of talking, and let's see if the audio works. Are you there, Barrie?
I'm here. Good to be with you, Roy.
Thanks. It's always nice to talk to you. And so I guess the first question is, it's kind of jumping in the middle, but are you a believer in the authenticity of the Shroud, and what made you one?
Well, yes. Let me state without any hesitation that I have come to accept that the Shroud of Turin is the authentic burial shroud of the historic Jesus. It was a long journey to get there because when I was first asked to participate in the scientific examination of the Shroud of Turin, I said basically no, because I felt that this wasn't something that I wanted to get involved with. I felt this was more of a religious object. I was raised in an Orthodox tradition. I didn't really know much about Christianity at the time, but I felt very uncomfortable perhaps getting involved with something that was such a iconic kind of symbol of Christianity in many respects. So I basically said no, and it was, but there are certain properties of the image on the shroud that are truly unique to that piece of cloth and to that image. And so my curiosity as a professional technical photographer certainly was there. And so I was very interested in the shroud from an imaging point of view, but I was very apprehensive about getting involved with as something I saw as a kind of a religious symbol.
I was rather uncomfortable with the whole thing, and I had felt, do I really want to get involved with this? But the primary purpose of the team was simply to determine how the image was formed. It wasn't to try and prove this was Jesus. It wasn't trying to prove the resurrection or something of that nature. And there was very little talk about religion. So a few months into the project, I was still feeling a little uncomfortable, and a couple of new members had been added to our team from the Jet Propulsion Laboratories in Pasadena, but I'd never been on a really purely scientific team like the Shroud of Turin Research Project. It was truly unique because it had experts from Los Alamos National Laboratories and the Air Force Weapons Lab and Sandia Laboratories and the Jet Propulsion Lab and a number of other very high-tech scientific organizations. So it was a great honor actually to be in and amongst that group of people. And of course, Roy, you and I've had now some time to sit and talk to each other, and you know that for me to talk is not that difficult. I do a lot of it. But in those days, I was a very quiet guy. I was the fly on the wall. I was so in awe of being in a room with scientists of this caliber that I kept my mouth shut, and perhaps that's how I learned some things in my involvement with these guys.
Some of the unique image characteristics of the image on the shroud.
Well, I'll go right to the one that hooked me immediately, and it's a little difficult. Photography is worth, photographs worth 1,000 words. I'll see if I can do it less than 1,000 words here. One of the most unique properties of the image is that the lights and darks of the image itself, or the image density as we call it, is directly proportionate to the distance between the cloth and the body at the moment the image formed. That means that depth, or spatial information was encoded into the shroud's image. Ultimately, that can be extracted, and one can form a natural relief of the human form that cloth covered, and normal photography and normal artworks do not incorporate that kind of depth or spatial information, much like a topographical map. Now, that was something that was discovered early on by a few members of our team, and they used an old analog device called a VP8 image analyzer. But that device extracted and yielded the natural relief of the form of the man that was covered by the cloth, and a normal photograph or a normal artwork does not incorporate that kind of data. So that was the catalyst that caused these guys to want to form a team and go to Turin and try and figure out how an image like that could form on a sheet of linen. And that property was the one that hooked me right from the beginning.
Okay, so you heard that. So you know what he's talking about in that sense. Let me let him rest for a moment. Let him have a sip of iced coffee. That's what I've been sipping. And let me show you what he's talking about. This blew me away when I first saw it. But anyway, here we have, he talked about a VP8 image analyzer. That was the kind of old tech way of making a 3D image out of the information which is encoded in the, how did he put it, image density in between the darker areas and the lighter areas. There is information in the shades of gray, so to speak, that you can use to reconstruct a 3D image. This technology has been used for mapping the surface of Mars, but it was actually developed, he pointed out in our interview, for, I believe, X-rays for medical purposes. But anyway, there you have on the screen a 1978 version, so to speak, of the 3D image that was formed on the 3D image that was decoded from the image on the Shroud of Turin. But now we have, that was an analog device. Now we have, of course, digital computers and stuff. So this is a kind of another one, a one done with a digital computer of both the front and the back of the shroud. There's other things that mess up the 3D image, of course, like the stains on the shroud and the blood stains and the scorch marks and so forth. So, but you can clearly see the front of Jesus there. And somebody took this 3D image. It's actually at Notre Dame Center in Jerusalem, commissioned a sculptor to take the image from this VP8 analyzer, essentially, that's encoded on the Shroud of Turin, and sculpt it and make a statue. And it's very striking. Maybe I'll show the whole statue first. But there you have it. There you have Jesus after the crucifixion, the image on the shroud. And that statue is from the decoding of the 3D image. Of course, some detail had to be added, but it's completely consistent with the visual image on the shroud, plus the 3D encoded information in the shades of gray on the shroud. I think you'll see when you see that body there that it's not the resurrected Jesus. That's images on the shroud. It's the buried Jesus whose image is on the shroud. You know, he's lying there. His eyes are probably covered with coins or shards of pottery. In other words, his eyes are not open, but they may not be closed either. They may be covered. But anyway, there you have it, with his hands modestly folded over his private area and so forth. And it's breathtaking when one sees this sculpture that's made from the shroud photo. Here is his face. Note that you see, by the way, when I go back and forth between shroud photos and things, left and right will be flipped at times because the shroud image is a negative image. And so when a negative is taken of it to make the gray images that we usually look at, the left and right are flipped. So anyway, I get very confused about that. So I just wanted to let you know beforehand. You'll see that, I guess it would be his right cheek, the bruise on his right cheek from where he was struck by the, you guys have all seen this, the Passion of the Christ, you know, where the soldier gave him a blow with his armored hand or whatever, or received a blow on his cheek. You see the beautiful patience in his face. You see that in the straight shroud photo. I'll have straight shroud photos, and maybe I should have started with them, but I want to start with Barrie Schwortz. You see the blood running from his mouth. Anyway, what more can you say? There are some very visible on the shroud bloodstains from the crown of thorns, and you see a trickle of blood there. And so that's his face from the shroud. Yeah, it is breathtaking. Thank you, guys. By the way, I'm getting ahead of myself, but another reason this 3D information is so interesting is because one of the skeptics' theories, I could do a whole show, maybe I will, on the skeptics' disproving of the shroud. This may be a long show, by the way. I might have to divide this in two. My strategy was to not stifle myself, but to talk as much as I want. And if it runs too long, just to divide it into two shows. But anyway, the skeptics, sometimes they make like a clay mask of a man's face, or they actually use a volunteer. And then they put some colored powder or something on the guy's face or on a sheet, and they press it against the form, and they come up with this cartoonish, ridiculous thing that bears some resemblance to the face on the shroud. And then they say, see, this is how it's a fake. I'll show you some of that later in the show. Now, the problem with that is if you do that, if it's a contact image of any form, where there is contact, you will have color. Where there is no contact, you will have no color. Now, that's the case whether it's a scorch, if they took a metal statue and heated up the statue and tried to scorch the linen, which is what some of these skeptics have done, or whether they coated with iron oxide, you know, with this kind of like reddish powder and do it, which is what some of them have done. They'll either be image or non-image. Where the cloth is an inch away from the face, you aren't going to have a lighter image. which is what you have here because that's where the 3D information comes from. So the 3D-ness on the shroud means that the image could not have been produced by contact. Got it? It couldn't have been produced by contact. It had to be produced by something like light. Well, somebody asked me this in the chat. It could have been produced purely miraculously. I don't think God has to use a flash of light if he wants to produce the image. But if there was a physical intermediation, it would have had to be something like a flash of light, because as the distance increases, the intensity of the image decreases. That's a property that you don't have with physical contact. Anyway, so there you have the 3D information on the shroud. And I think it's time to go back to my friend Barrie Schwortz and hear the next stage in his conversion to or away from belief in the authenticity of the shroud. So let's go back to Barrie. Let me back up a second or two.
Like that could form on a sheet of linen. And that property was the one that hooked me right from the beginning.
This is the 3D.
I remember that you mentioned another thing that really pushed you over the edge, having to do with the bloodstains on the shroud.
Yeah, actually, that was one of the things that pushed me back over the other edge, basically, because when obviously, one of the primary theories was the shroud was some form of painting or artwork. So that was one of the things that we went there to determine. And I would say it took maybe 15 minutes with the shroud in front of me and with my high-powered magnifier in hand to realize that if this was a painting of some sort, it was a painting without paint, because you can look at it with a magnifying glass or better yet, of course, with a microscope, which we ultimately did, and you can see that there's no paint or pigment on the cloth. It's simply the discoloration of certain surface fibers that are responsible for that yellowish-colored image.
I'm going to stop there. I wasn't planning to, but because I just want to comment on what he said, which is, and I'll show some more pictures about this. This was not a high school project. These were scientists from jet propulsion laboratories, some government research. I don't remember all the places. There were 20 or 30 scientists, from the top government labs and university labs and stuff. And this is 1978, so the technology is primitive compared to today's technology, but it's pretty advanced even compared to Leonardo da Vinci, who was one of the claims that he made the shroud. But anyway, so here's some pictures of the examination of the shroud at the time. Let me, okay, just they're going to find paint if there's paint there. They're looking pretty close. This isn't a Mickey Mouse team. They did a lot of chemical analysis, which will come up later. So they have, the equipment for that. They have, let's see, what was I looking at? I don't even know what all this equipment is. These are just pictures of the scientific team, the STERP team, going about their business. And any of you guys were old enough to remember when computers looked like that? But anyway, it's if there was paint there, they would have found it awfully quickly. Now, when Barrie is talking about it being, I'm trying to find it being. Well, first of all, let me pull this up just because it is a picture of. It's not the best. Maybe I have a better one somewhere. I don't want to waste the time, so I'll pull up this picture. You guys have all seen probably the shroud. I'll later on have a much better close up of it. But that's Barrie's site, by the way, the Shroud of Turin website. It's shroud.com, and he's very conscientious. He puts up all the skeptics nonsense there also. So it's a link website. It's full of links, and it's full of links to serious research about the authenticity of the shroud, and it's also full of links to spurious skeptics debunking of the shroud, supposedly, and also debunking of the debunking. So there's the shroud, but that's not what I really want to show. What I really want to show was where. That's the problem when I go out of. Um, hmm. Okay, well that's one. Here it is. Here's a better example. This is actually what the image consists of. The image on the right there, what you have there is a pure photograph on the right and contrast enhanced on the left. Okay, so when you look at the shroud under a high magnifying glass, you see what's on the right. The image is fibers of the linen that are slightly darkened. That's what produces the image. Not pigment, not paint, not particles of anything, not scorching, which you would tell because, under a high-powered microscope, you would see the effect of burning of the fibers and so forth. What you see when you look at it is what's on the right. If you Photoshop it a little bit to increase the contrast so that the image is more visible, you get what's on the left. And I will have a whole section of today's show or the next show, depending on how fast I go through this, that that basically is all about the what produces the image, let's say. But for now, I just wanted to put a little introduction and figure out where I was with the with Barrie. Okay, and let's go back to Barrie.
But there's no paint or pigment added to create that color. And it took maybe 15 minutes for us to see that. But there was a problem, and that was that as we stood there and looked at this cloth, we noted that the blood stains on the cloth were still red. And old blood is supposed to turn black or brown often within an hour or even less. And here's blood that ostensibly might be 2,000 years old, at least 700 years old, based on, just looking at its recorded, documented, unbroken chain of history. And yet we have this blood still reddish and crimson in color. And that was a deal breaker for me. And that was a real question mark that ultimately took another 17 years or so before was properly answered, at least in my mind, for me to get over that and sort of push that aside and look at the other facts of the shroud as supporting its authenticity. But that was a deal breaker for me at the time.
Okay, so here you see I've pulled up. This is, of course, this is a contrast enhanced image too, or else the face wouldn't be quite so pronounced. But there you see the blood that Barrie is talking about. It's still red. These are the wounds on the head from the crown of thorns. By the way, there's a lot of really neat information on the shroud about details of what Jesus suffered. I'll talk about that in the course of the show too. But so Barrie, of course, being a Jewish skeptic, didn't like the fact that the blood was red. As he says, it's supposed to turn brown or black. Certainly within days, and so we're talking about 7 centuries since the shroud has been basically the where the shroud has been in the possession of whom. There's been an unbroken chain of custody since the 14th century. So I'll just zoom in, so to speak, and you see the red bloodstains. They're on the head there, and they're also, actually, they're all over the shroud. Here's a kind of schematic of where you find the bloodstains on the shroud. Around the wound in his side. By the way, those whitish or those big triangles that are a different color, those are patches where there was a fire that burned holes in the shroud and the shroud was patched, and that's those big patches that you see there. Unfortunately, there's a patch that kind of overlaps the wound in the side, but you see the red circle around the bloodstain from the wound in the side. We'll be talking more about that bloodstain too. You see all the bloodstains around the head there that are outlined. You see the nail hole in his wrist. We'll talk about why the nail hole was in his wrist, even though the nail was actually through his palm. That'll come up in the show too. But you see that there, around where his wrist is, you see a pronounced blood stain. You'll also see on his arms it looks a little bit like a chain, right? You'll see the drip of blood on both his left and right arms. I wish I had a way of using a pointer in real time on these pictures. I have to figure out how to do that, but anyway. You see those chains of blood drips. Now, there's something really interesting about those blood drips. I mean, the skeptics, Barrie will say this later in the show, but what the skeptics do is they take one aspect, one little aspect, and they try to show how that little aspect can be faked. They're not very successful doing it, but maybe they're slightly successful doing it. And they ignore the other 450 aspects, which can't be faked. But anyway, let me show one of those, which is the blood drip angles, okay? Because we know that Jesus was crucified like this, right? So the blood would have dripped down what was down at the time, which would have been like from here in this direction, right? And then he was he was wrapped in the shroud. At that point, of course, this direction is no longer this direction because his arm is, crossed over in front of him. Well, if you look at those blood drips that you see there on the shroud and you analyze them, this is what you find. You find that the direction of the flow of the blood on the shroud wrapped is correct for what the direction of the flow of the blood would have been if he was hanging on a cross with his arms at an angle of 65 degrees. Isn't that neat? As that text says, the bloodstains on the shroud are consistent with that of a man who had been beaten and then died in the position of crucifixion. The V-shaped blood flows on the arms show they were in an elevated and extended position at the times the wounds were drying, I guess. I don't know what the next word was. Dripping, I guess, is the next word. And you can even calculate from the direction of the blood drips that the angle of his arm was 65 degrees. So I think that's pretty darn neat. So let's see if there's anything else before I go on with more of Barrie. Yeah, here, this one, he talked about the redness of the blood. This really shows the redness of the blood. This is from his back. This is from the image of his back on the shroud. And you can see it looks like very fresh blood. It is very, very red. And you can also see, it's a little hard to see because the blood kind of obscures it. But right to the side, I guess, whoops, how do I do this? To this, right there, right to the side of the little picture of me in the corner, you can see some non-bloody thread, which shows the some of the image, some of the dark, it looks like dark straw and light straw, right, from where the linen was darkened and where it wasn't darkened. So anyway, okay. Here's another place where this is his feet. I don't know if we'll have a close-up of his feet later in the show, but this you can see this is you can't see much of his feet, but these are his 2 feet, and you can see the blood stains which come from the nail holes in his feet. So I think that's probably all we have there. I can go back for a moment to Barrie, and you'll see the answer to this mystery, right? That is what we're looking at right now. I tend to forget, so you're forgiven for forgetting. But here for 18 years, Barrie was seriously disturbed by the redness of the blood, and he finds out the answer. So here we go.
And it wasn't until, 1995, I was on the phone with Dr. Alan Adler, another Jewish member of our team and a world-renowned blood chemist, and I happened to bring up the fact that nobody had explained the red blood. And Al said, "Didn't you read my paper?" And I said, "I did, but I'm not a blood chemist, so it's a little over my head." He said, "Well, I found a very high content of bilirubin in the blood that was on the shroud. Bilirubin is generated by the liver, typically when somebody's beaten severely, tortured, not given any water, the body goes into shock. the liver starts pumping bilirubin into the bloodstream. Bilirubin is a hemolytic agent, breaks down the red blood cell walls, and the blood remains red forever. And, of course, that was sort of a aha moment for me, because that was the last piece of the puzzle all those years later, back in 1995, that ultimately pushed me over the threshold of accepting the Shroud as authentic.
I assume.
So here I just have a little explanation of that, because I want to understand. I do a lot of work preparing for these shows. I have to do a lot of research, because I don't want to just echo people's words. I want to have a little bit of an understanding of what's going on. So here is the research report. Bilirubin. Sounds like a nice Jewish guy, right? Bilirubin. I probably had a friend in high school named Bilirubin. But anyway, it's a test for the presence of proteins, and during a test for a presence of proteins in the shroud's man's blood, an extraordinarily high bilirubin count was found in traumatic shock, as would be experienced under flogging and crucifixion. The liver converts hemoglobin from burst red blood cells into bilirubin, which remains in the blood clots and gives them a red to orange color. Okay. The red color of the shroud's blood supports the forensic conclusion that the blood was from someone who suffered a traumatic death, as depicted in the body images, which Jesus of Nazareth did. Now, if you watched the last show on Eucharistic miracles, I think this is really neat, because all of these physical miracles that God has given to us of the proof of the Catholic faith, of these, at least the last show and this show, give testimony. They give testimony to what Jesus went through for us. They give testimony to his suffering. In the show on Eucharistic miracles, there was a lot of forensic analysis which showed how much Jesus suffered. The Shroud of Turin shows how much Jesus suffered. The wounds, of course, show that. The scourge marks show that. We'll talk about the scourge marks in a while. But even the fact that the remaining blood, the dried blood on the shroud, is red rather than black by now, shows that. So God not only wanted to give us proof, but in the proof that he gave us, he wanted us to compassionate Jesus. He wanted us to be aware of his suffering. He wanted us to have sympathy and empathy with Jesus' suffering. Every saint says there is no more valuable prayer than meditating on the passion of Christ. Simply sitting there and thinking about how much he suffered, and hence how much he loves us, and hence how infinite our value is in the eyes of God, right? Because it's dogma that Jesus would have suffered everything he suffered to save just Roy Showman, to save just Cairo Ayres or Barrett Hoffrath, or, those are some names on the chat screen. Just you, okay? And all of these proofs that God has given us, drive home the nail, the bad pun, nail home the fact that this was not a walk in the park. This was really, 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 it was a blank check. Jesus wrote God the Father an absolutely blank check of how much suffering he was willing to bear for the salvation of a human soul. So anyway, I think it's really neat that this comes through in the in the shroud, and even in these forensic chemical analysis details of the shroud, like the bilirubin. Anyway, back to Barrie.
That the cloth itself of the shroud is very consistent with its authenticity.
Let me back up.
Shroud is very consistent. The cloth. I assume that the cloth itself of the shroud is very consistent with its authenticity.
It is. It's a very, actually, would have been quite an expensive cloth in the first century. Excuse me. It's a herringbone woven cloth, which is sort of a 3/2 under twill weave. And it was not a common cloth. Would have been an expensive cloth in the first century. And of course, skeptics like to say that, well, they didn't have that kind of cloth in the first century. And I guess technically, skeptics could be right, because the first known example of herringbone weave was 500 BC. So obviously, it's been around for a long time, well before the Shroud of Turin. My feeling is this: it tells us in the Gospels that the cloth was provided by Joseph of Arimathea, a wealthy man. It doesn't tell us much else about him, but just the fact that he was a wealthy man would indicate that he could afford a high-quality cloth like this. So, but it's very consistent with that kind of burial cloth, and it's also, as it states in the Torah, of clean linen raiment. It's pure linen with no cotton or wool interwoven with it, no mixing of the kinds. And that is right from the Torah, that clean linen raiments would be used, particularly if somebody of high stature, someone that certainly the disciples of Jesus believed, they believed he was the Messiah. They wouldn't have wrapped him in a cheap piece of cloth. They would have gotten the best they could get in their hands at that moment in their time.
In fact, it wouldn't be kosher if it was cotton and linen, right?
That's correct.
And they're not going to bury the Messiah in a trafe cloth. I have a vague memory. It is a little dangerous.
Okay. What we have on the screen is a sample of a herringbone weave. It's obviously not the shroud itself, but you see the herringbone weave. I should let Barrie say it. I'm going to steal his thunder, but it comes from him. This would have been very expensive cloth, and it wouldn't have been native made in Judea, in Israel. It would have been imported. They made it in Syria, they made it in Egypt, and most likely it was an expensive cloth that was actually Joseph of Arimathea's. We know he was a rich man. We know he donated his grave, and I better just play the recording because I'm duplicating what's going to come up. But as to the chat about Our Lady weaving it, I'm not speaking authoritatively, but I have a feeling it is not something subject. I don't want to say. I think it was Joseph of Arimathea's. I don't think it's something that a non-professional, let's say, was in a position to make. It was very rare. It was very expensive. It was a very difficult thing to do. And Mary, she certainly didn't weave it in between Jesus's arrest and his burial. So, yeah, sure. I don't know anything authoritative. But anyway, let me go back to the tape before I get in more trouble.
Dangerous, flying by the seat of my pants. But I have a vague memory that my grandfather lived with his burial cloth to be, that it was a tradition to have it in advance to remind yourself of your mortality. Does that ring a bell?
I'm certainly not an authority on that subject, but I think it may well be a tradition that many people would prepare themselves for burial by having these materials already in place.
In which case, Joseph of Arimathea could have simply donated his burial cloth to be
exactly.
He donated the grave according to the scriptures
as well. So if he had a grave, it's most likely he would have also had the burial shroud, and so he gave that up and gave it over so that they could use it for Jesus. So the way I see it, that's very consistent with what Jewish customs and culture would do.
When you mentioned the blood remaining red, I forgot the name of the blood component, but you said that it happens when the victim dies in a great deal of pain or agony. Is there anything else about the shroud that reflects frankly, the suffering that Jesus went through during the Passion?
Sure. I mean, if we look at the gospel account of what was done to Jesus, we can start at the top of the head. He was crowned or capped with probably a cap of thorns. They didn't weave a pretty little crown to put around his head. And imagine telling a Roman soldier that this criminal you're about to kill, before you do that, let's make him look nice. That's silly. They took a nasty thorn bush and they smashed it down on his head, and the head of the man of the shroud is covered with wounds and bloodstains as if from a cap or crown of thorns. If you go down and look at his face,
Okay, so let's start at the top. Another bad pun. Let's start at the top with the cap of thorns. There is an excellent. Whoops, wrong. Why is that? Oh, I know why that happens. There's an excellent exhibit at Notre Dame Center in Jerusalem dedicated to the shroud, and this is a photograph I actually took there. I usually bring my groups when I take them to Israel to the shroud exhibit there. This is a cap of thorns, and it is made out of the native thorns from around Jerusalem that would have been available at the time. And there are, I believe, 3 species of thorns in this cap. There are at least 2. They're very long, thin, strong ones, and they're shorter ones also. And there's also forensic evidence that the thorns actually pierced his skull. They were driven down so hard. And I don't know if you guys have ever gotten a wound on the top of your head, but it's very, very painful. Okay, I'll tell the story. I probably shouldn't. But I was praying early one morning in my little chapel. This was during Lent. And I prayed, I prayed to have just a little, tiny taste of what Jesus suffered. And I prostrated myself. I used to do that in those days when I was praying alone, you know. It's a habit I picked up in the Carthusian monastery. They prostrate themselves after communion for like half an hour. And this was before dawn. I mean, this is like maybe 4 o'clock in the morning. So I put my head down against the floor, and I thought it was a thorn. It was a wasp. I put my head down on a wasp that then stung me, and boy, did it hurt. I can't imagine, none of us can imagine what one of those thorns, how much one of those thorns would have hurt, much less that cap of thorns. So let me try to find, okay, so that's that image. Here is a painting that is based on the shroud of, you know, a helmet-like cap of thorns on the head of Jesus, and I'm sure the blood would have been streaming down his face, as a matter of fact, blinding him. And you guys are probably familiar with this, but it's certainly worth, in this context, seeing it once again. Here's a little clip from the Passion of the Christ.
Aspicite illum, regem vermum. Ave, rex verminosus, ave! Dolor regalis!
Okay, so as I said a few minutes ago, it's always very worthwhile to remind ourselves of what Jesus suffered. Earlier, I don't know if this is out of sequence or not, but remember the shroud, the 3D image, the 3D sculpture, which was done from the 3D information on the Shroud of Turin, showed a big welt on Jesus's cheek. And here is simply a photograph of the shroud, and you'll see that on the right, the like lower right cheek, you can see that swelling, that welt. Let me go back to Barrie and see where he goes here.
Face is severely beaten, both cheekbones swollen, one more so than the other. There's blood.
So there, that's why I put this slide in the sequence. He just mentioned the swollen cheekbone
On his face and on his beard. If you go, beaten, both cheekbones swollen, one more so than the other. There's blood on his face and on his beard. If you go down a little further, from the neck to the ankles, on the back, as well as the front of the body, are well over 120 scourge marks from a Roman flagrum. It's a documented torture device the Romans used. It had dumbbell-shaped lead weights on the end. But we have scourge marks literally from his neck down to his ankles, and not just on the back of the body, but also on the front. We go down a little bit further, and there's a large oval spear wound in the side.
Okay, so let me stop there for a moment and show some pictures and talk a little bit. I was blessed to be able to go to Turin in 98 and 2000, both times, to see the shroud during the exhibits. And actually went there alone so that I could spend, 3 or 4 days literally sitting in front of the shroud. I was thrown out. I was thrown out after about 4 days. The one of the guards came up to me and said, don't you think you've been here enough? You should make space for other people. But in my own defense, I'll say sometimes the room was crowded and sometimes it was empty. And whenever there was a shortage of seats up front, I would move to the back of the room. And I would only go up front when the room was empty. So I don't think he was, all that fair in taking umbrage. Those are the two best places I've been thrown out of were the Holy House of Loreto in Loreto and in front of the Shroud of Turin. But anyway, I have a bunch of let's see what we have here. Let me start with his face because Barrie started with his face. There is, of course, the swollen cheekbone and the major drip of blood there. But then Barrie was talking about the scourge marks. Now, the reason I mentioned that about being there is it's absolutely breathtaking because every inch, front and back, has these crisscrossed lines. You see them there, like herringbone in a way. From the two scourges coming from the two different sides. You see this in the Passion of the Christ. Now, the movie of the Passion of the Christ, they used a different kind of scourge, artistic license. They used a kind of scourge which was used to kill somebody, which had hooks in it to flay the skin. In fact, forensically from the shroud, this was the flagrum that was used, which is those dumbbell things that could presumably kill you, but at least gave you a good chance of surviving in order to be crucified. And obviously they wanted to crucify him. So I'll just show some slides of the scourge marks. This is the black and white. Well, anyway, I'll just show them. I have to explain them. This is the same image, in a more enhanced kind of a form, higher contrast print. Of course, you see that crisscross scourging. You also see, of course, the hole in his side from the lance. This is the back now, okay? So obviously the lance went in his side, so, part of the wound extends to his back. This is kind of interesting. Here you have a slide. First of all, it shows the torture instrument. I'll show that by itself here. So this is a flagrum. This is what they would have used. And you see that it's got multiple strips, and each strip has these two lead weights, and which are what made the wounds on his back. Now the let's see where we are. So this is where I just was. You can see here on the left, what you see is a drawing of the shroud, which shows detail, which can be seen in the photograph, but is a little bit hard to make out. But obviously, the person who did the drawing, had a large image and a lot of time. So you see, this is the dorsal side. This is the back side, and you see the it's upside down, by the way. That's because the shroud was wrapped, from the head to the feet and up the other side. So it's one long strip of linen. So if the head is at the top of the front, then you'll have it be from head to toe front side. And as you continue down, it'll be from toe to head back side. So that's why this is upside down. So that's his head at the bottom of the shroud, and that's his feet at the top of the shroud. So the very dark area at the top is the blood from the nail wound in his foot. And then you have his legs, you have the back of his calves, and you see all of the crisscrossed scourge marks on the back of his calves. And then moving up, you have the back of his thighs, and you see all the crisscrossed scourge marks on the back of his thighs. And then moving up, you have his tuchos, as as we say in Judaism. And then moving up, you have his back, and all of it has the crisscross scourge marks, including where he would sit. And then moving down to his shoulders, you see dark areas, which are the wounds from carrying the cross. And one of the saints, someone is probably going to tell me in the chat which of the visionary saints it was. Somehow I think it was Saint Bridget, but I could be wrong about that. Said that Jesus told her that the wound in his shoulder carrying the cross was actually the most painful of his wounds. And then moving towards the bottom, which is moving up towards his head, you see the blood from the crown of thorns, the back of his head. And again, if you look at the left side, the schematic drawing, you see that the scourge marks go all the way from his feet up to his neck. And then the same thing is done on the front, and you see his front. And again, you see all the detail. You see the blood. It's around where that first set of patches is on the right-hand side. You see the lance, where the lance went into his side, and you see the very dark area, which is blood from that wound. But you also see, and of course you see the wounds on his face and the blood from the crown of thorns. But you also see from his shoulders, literally, from his shoulders down to his ankles, on the front side also, you see the scourge marks. And there is no break in them. There is no break in them. You know, there are scourge marks on his forearms. There are scourge marks on his belly. There are scourge marks on his lower rib cage. There are scourge marks on his breast. There are scourge marks on the front of his thighs. There are scourge marks on the front of his calves. There are scourge marks on his hips. And there you have it. I mean, that's let me go back to this. And when you look at the shroud, well, this is actually a negative, so I don't know if I actually, I don't think I actually have many slides that show the shroud the way it looks when you see it, which is of course that pale linen cloth, because I chose slides that amplify it, so to speak. So anyway, here is a, this is actually just the pale linen cloth, but it's the blood. This is a close-up of the wound in his side, which of course is where the burn was, so the patch is over it, but you see all of the blood. And with that, let me go back to our friend Barrie.
With the blood flow emanating from it. And interestingly, when we look at that blood flow from it, wound in the side with the blood flow emanating from it, and interestingly, when we look at that blood flow with ultraviolet fluorescence photography, we can see a serum halo surrounding that blood stain. And when we examine other blood stains on the shroud, we find that serum halo around many of the blood stains on the cloth. And for somebody to tell me that an artist put that there in hopes that someday they would invent a technology that would allow us to see these serum stains is sort of ludicrous.
What's a serum halo?
The serum is the liquid portion of your blood. You know, our blood is comprised of a liquid portion, which is called serum, and then it has red blood cells and white blood cells that give it its color and also protect us from, viruses and things. That's what the white blood cells are there for, to fight off disease and viruses and bacteria. And so the liquid portion of the blood is only, that serum stain is only visible with UV fluorescence. It's not visible to the naked eye. So to get me to believe that some medieval guy, some forger, put that there in hopes that someday we would find it is sort of ludicrous. So we have that, and we continue down on looking at the.
Okay, so this is worth paying some attention to or talking about a little bit, because it's another ridiculous. I mean, this whole series, maybe I should put my face here instead of all this holy stuff if I'm just going to babble. But this whole series, including the evolution business, remember the theme of the series is sort of like the Matrix. We are living in this fictionalized reality. I don't mean, the sky and the trees and everything, but I mean what we are brought up to believe, what the world believes, what is presented in the newspapers and the magazines and everything. I saw a chat just now that one of you watching, I think it was your mother, believed one of these newspaper articles debunking the Shroud, showing that it's been disproven and stuff. So you have to suspend disbelief in order to not believe in the Shroud. In other words, you have to take a blue pill not to believe in the Shroud. You cannot rationally look at this evidence and conclude that the Shroud is a forgery. And, there are details after details after details after details. This show is probably going to run into 2 shows as I look at the clock. And even then, I'm not even scratching the surface. And one of these things is this business of the blood halo. So apparently, the blood has its, its red blood cell part with the red color, and it's got some clear serum in it also. And I think I have a description here. Let me see if I have a scientific description. No, I don't. So anyway, so it's got a clear liquid also, rather separates out, and there's this clear serum also in the blood. And when it flows from the wound, you have the red blood. That's the main part of the wound, or the blood stain. And then around its edges, you have where the clear serum from the blood has been absorbed. And it's only visible under ultraviolet light. As Barrie said, why would a forger 700 years ago have forged something that can only be seen under ultraviolet light? First of all, I'm sure no one knew about serum in the blood. But even if he did, he certainly didn't know about ultraviolet light. Come on, 600 years before electricity was discovered. So anyway, it's just ridiculous. Here's that close up. I brought it up briefly while Barrie was talking. That is the wound in the side under ultraviolet light. You see the reddish stain. Of course, that triangle, a gray triangle, is the patch. You see the reddish stain, and you see that white outline, which wasn't done by Photoshop, but is the serum halo. And let me see if I have anything else that's relevant to show there. You have a serum halo, similarly, around the wound in the wrist. This is a little bit less of a close-up, and it's black and white, so it's a little harder to see. But you see, it looks like there's a finger, that finger in the dark red. In other words, the blood is there's a drip of the blood that ends in a kind of finger shape. And you see a white halo around that. That is a serum halo around the wrist blood. Oh, here's a close-up. Good, I did make a close-up of it there. At least you have a chance of seeing that there. So you see that little white crown around the blood, actually around most of that blood spot, which is the serum halo. And this is the wound in the just in the black and white negative. You can see that same finger. Of course, this isn't to see the serum halo. This is just the negative of the original shroud, so it's not going to show, but that shows where it is. You'll see, by the way, you'll note that left and right has just been flipped. Like, they keep getting flipped with these pictures because of negative prints being made. So that is the wrist hole. And here, from the 3D statue, is the hole in the wrist. And I think Barrie's about to talk about it, if I remember correctly. So let's go back to Barrie.
Man's body, and we can only see the back of his hands. We cannot body. So we have that, and we continue down on looking at the man's body, and we can only see the back of his hands. We cannot. His arms are crossed over his torso, so we can only see one exit wound at the back of one hand or wrist, where one of the crucifixion nails would have come out. If we go further down, we can then see the blood stains at the feet and ankles from the crucifixion nails that were used to hold his feet in place on the cross.
Okay, so I guess I'm a little. I don't remember exactly the sequence of things Barrie talked about. Okay, so here are his feet further down, and there's just a negative of the shroud image that shows the holes in his feet. We just saw there's the hole in the back of his hand. I'm sure Barrie's going to talk more about that. There are the wounds in his feet, and again using the that 3D information and the sculpture that was made out of it. There is his feet, and you can see. Again, who can imagine the pain? That's obviously the entry wound of the nail. It actually looks triangular, as I recall. I'm not 100% sure, but I think that the nails from the crucifixion, which are the relics at Santa Croce in Rome, are actually triangular. I'm not 100% sure, but I'm actually pretty sure they are. And it looks like a triangular wound there on his foot. So anyway, let's see what Barrie has to say, and I'll know where to go from listening to him.
So everything that is described in the Gospels is documented with absolute 100% forensic accuracy on the Shroud of Turin. So it's a very strong argument in favor of this is not an artwork. The only way this could have really occurred, in my opinion, is by some interaction between a cloth and the body that it covered. And
I'm going to actually interrupt Barrie, as much as I hate to do it, to answer a question that has been asked several times on the chat stream. I guess I'm advertising the chat stream, but you guys who are watching the reruns, just watching the saved version of these talks, if you join us live, you get to complain, and if I have time, I read the chats as I'm talking and I respond to them. So a number have said, this is assuming the body wasn't washed before burial. And that is true. The body wasn't washed before burial. Is that true? When was it washed? When was it washed? I don't know. I guess I'd better stay out of trouble and just say, I don't know. It is a very good question. And I've just humiliated myself, but I had a friend who was a monk who used to say there's no humility without humiliation. So I don't think there's an account of the body being washed in the Gospels, is there? So, but there is a scene of the body being washed in the Passion of the Christ. So I just don't know. And it might have something to do with Jewish law, and I will look into that, because I know that by Jewish law, everything belonging to the body has to be buried with the body. So, for instance, organ transplants are essentially, in some sense, they're forbidden, because if you give your liver to somebody, that liver is supposed to be buried with you when you die. So I don't know if that includes the blood, and therefore the body would be buried with the blood from the wounds or not. So that's a little speculation. Don't take me too seriously, but I'll look into it. Anyway, I keep getting into trouble. I'll let Barrie get into trouble because I know he doesn't get into trouble. So back to Barrie. Actually, I don't remember where I was. Let me back up a little bit with Barrie.
Turin. So it's a very strong argument in favor of this is not an artwork. The only way this could have really occurred, in my opinion, is by some interaction between a cloth and the body that it covered. And to me, that's really the only way this could have happened. It's certainly not an artwork or a photograph or a scorch, as some skeptics would have us believe.
I had the pleasure and privilege to see the Shroud when it was on exhibit. I think it was in 98 and 2000. And I remember being struck by a couple of things. One was you could actually see two crisscrossed kind of lines of direction of the scourge marks, like that there was a person whipping him from either side.
It's true. Now, the guys who are far better at this than I am, the real forensic guys, have studied the scourge marks on the body and were able to determine that there were two men applying the scourges or the flagrum to the body, and they could even determine which one was right-handed and which one was left-handed, if I remember correctly. And when you look at the shroud now and you study the forensic aspects of it, and no less than 3 real experts have done so over the last 30 years, you have to realize that this is a cloth that wrapped a real body. Certainly some medieval person trying to create an image like this would not have had a clue how to do it and would not have been able to incorporate the forensic accuracy that we see there.
That begs the question, if you assembled your team of shroud scientists with the project of counterfeiting the shroud, could they even do it today?
You know, that's a great question, Roy. No. Ironically, we live in the most image-oriented era of human history. Everybody's got a camera and a computer in their hand nowadays. So imaging is something we all do. And yet with all the technology that's available to us now, no one has been able to duplicate the chemistry and physics and create an image with those same properties. You can make something that looks like the shroud. I mean, after all, my photographs have been on the internet for almost 20 years. And so you can use that as a reference. And the skeptics who use my photographs as a reference, even they have trouble getting it to look like the man of the shroud. It's more cartoon-like in most cases. And when we then apply some of the same tests that we applied to the Shroud of Turin, the chemistry, the physics are all completely off and don't match at all what's on that cloth. And that's, to me, you know, one of the great kind of questions that we answered was, could this be manufactured? And I don't believe there's anyone who could come even into the ballpark of making an image with these same properties. No one ever has.
With all of our 21st century technology, much less
with all of our
13th century.
Exactly.
Okay, good. Now I get to my hobby, which is making fun of skeptics. I've been looking forward to this all show. Actually, I've been looking forward to the whole all show. But it's time to make fun of skeptics. Because and so let me give a little humorous relief here. So let me find this. Okay, let's see, what should I be talking about? Where should I start? I'll just start with this. Okay, this was in all the news in 2009. Italian scientist reproduces Shroud of Turin. This is Reuters, which of course is a worldwide top news agency. I found this also on BBC and CNN and all kinds of stuff. An Italian scientist says he has reproduced the Shroud of Turin, a feat, he says, proves definitely that the linen some Christians revere, that's us superstitious ignoramuses, us Christians who revere as Jesus Christ's burial cloth, is a medieval fake. Let me see if I have a slide that says it's a fake. Oh boy, you know, I always only realized during the show what I wish I had made slides out of. But anyway, some of the headlines said Shroud proven to be a fake because it's been reproduced by this Italian scientist. Here, first of all, is the image that he produced. Okay, so as Barrie said, what they're doing is they're taking the photographs of the shroud and they're trying to make something that looks like the face on the shroud. This professor of chemistry took one of his students and put a mask on his face of some sort and covered a sheet with red ochre, which is rust powder, essentially. I'm not exactly sure what it is. And push the sheet around the mask on his face, and then dried out the sheet, and was able to put it in an oven, and was able to produce that picture of the face. Now, first of all, it's not even a very good picture. I mean, it's very clumsy and cartoonish compared to the real thing. But all it is a picture of the face. I mean, or a, kind of a, I don't even know what to call it, a kind of a cartoon of the picture of the Shroud of Turin. It's only the face. It doesn't have any 3D information. It doesn't even have any modulated grays in between contact and non-contact, right? Because you can't do that. If it's a contact image, there's going to be nothing. Either it's going to be touching or it's not going to be touching. There's no pigment. There's no paint. I mean, there's no paint on the shroud. There's no coloration on the shroud. There's no red oxide on the shroud. There's no powder of any sort on the shroud. This is a disproof. Who was it? Was it Chesterton? I had that quote in an earlier show. Oh no, it was was that Frenchman that said to people who didn't. Oh, I forgot even what. Oh, it was about evolution, and he said, "You people who deny this, what you believe in order to deny evolution is far more difficult to believe than what we Christians believe in believing in creation." So this is true. I mean, if you believe. I mean, you can't even believe it. I mean, I'm sorry, there's nothing to believe. How is that the Shroud of Turin? With all of the chemistry, all of the what isn't on the shroud, all of what is on the shroud, all of the detail on the shroud, all of the, everything on the shroud. And you have a little cartoon of the face, and that's disproving it. But anyway, I didn't do a great job. But here is actually the money quote. Okay, so this is from the Reuters article. That was the headline. An Italian scientist says he has reproduced the Shroud of Turin, a feat that he says proves definitively that the linen some Christians revere, us ignoramuses, superstitious, will believe anything, as Jesus Christ's burial cloth is a medieval fake. We have shown that it is possible to reproduce something which has the same characteristics as a shroud. No, it doesn't have the same characteristics as a shroud. Remember, the image on the shroud is from selective fading of the fibers. Plus, it's a negative, plus lots of other things that we'll get into later in the show or in the next episode. This is hardly the same characteristics as a shroud. Anyway, he's saying it's the same characteristics because you've made this like charcoal mask of the face. Not really charcoal, but rust mask of the face. Same characteristics as shroud. Luigi Garlascelli, who is due to illustrate the results at a conference on the paranormal this weekend in northern Italy, said on Monday. A professor of organic chemistry at the University of Pavia. Garlascelli made available to Reuters the paper he will deliver and the accompanying comparative photographs. I'm sure those comparative photographs were of the face only. Garlascelli reproduced the full-size shroud. He didn't share those photographs with us, so it's hard for me to believe that. But anyway, using materials and techniques that were available in the Middle Ages, they placed a linen sheet flat over a volunteer and then rubbed it with a pigment containing traces of acid. A mask was used for the face. Now, I highlighted the money quote. Garlascelli received funding for his work by an Italian association of atheists and agnostics, but said it had no effect on the results. Sure, it had no effect on the results. Money has no odor, he said. This was done scientifically. Okay, so he was paid by an association of atheists to do this research. People tell me don't be political, but don't watch the show if you don't want me to be political. Where does global warming come from? It comes from hundreds of millions of dollars paid to institutions to establish global warming. I'm sure hundreds of millions of dollars coming just from Soros. but also from lots of other parties who want the one world government. Where does COVID-19's high mortality rate come from? And you know, the need for masks to continue, even though Fauci himself is on tape saying that masks don't do any good. But anyway, let's leave that aside. You know, follow the money. Follow the money. These hoaxes, including, by the way, the hoax of evolution. Basically, I'm not saying that Soros is funding hundreds of millions of dollars to colleges to teach evolution. But I am saying that if you do not believe in evolution and you're on the faculty of a university and you let it be known that you don't believe in evolution, you sure as heck better have tenure. And even if you have tenure, they'll do everything they can to try to get you fired. So that's also money talking. It's like starvation talking or losing your job talking if you're not with the party line. And if you watched the show on evolution that had James, what was his last name? Was it Wood? What was he? He was a synthetic organic chemist who said it's absolutely nonsense what evolution says about the origin of life from non-life. You remember that? Someone will tell me maybe what his name was. He said that in private, Nobel Prize winning scientists have told him that they agree that evolution has no viable explanation for the origin of life. In private, they've said that, because even though they have Nobel Prizes, they're not about to say it in public, because they will lose all their credibility, they will be mocked, and they will probably lose their university positions and their National Science Foundation grants and so forth. And if you contest global warming, you are sure to lose all funding as well as your job and everything. So, you know, when they say, you know, 98% of scientists believe in global warming, first of all, that's not actually true, because that study that said 98% of scientists actually found 51% of scientists agreed that global warming existed, but that number wasn't high enough, so they changed their definition or whatever. I forgot exactly what they did to get that number up. But basically, you know, 100% of scientists who want to keep their research grants believe in global warming. Okay, so, and Barrie is going to go into this now, I hope. I don't know how much longer he has to talk, but I'm going to jump to the end. You'll hear it from Barrie. The carbon-14 dating, the one person in charge of the carbon-14 dating, as soon as he made public the results that the shroud was a fake, immediately got an anonymous 1 million British pound gift grant, okay? Which in those days, I believe, was about $2.5 million. It was back in the 70s. Okay, this had nothing to do with his results. The fact that, oh, you'll see, it's really a neat story. I'll let Barrie tell it. But anyway, let me go back to Barrie for the moment.
I will. I'll say something that's, of course, painfully obvious, but all of the theories, or all of the kind of pseudo debunking that says that was somehow faked, would be predicated on the idea that 500 years before the invention of photography, they decided to fake a negative. When there was no such concept.
That's correct.
Okay, so this is what you just brought up. Now, I haven't been showing many pictures of the original shroud. I've been showing negatives. The picture on the left there, which is in sepia tones, that's what you see when you look at the shroud. And it's a negative image. And if you make a negative of a negative, you get a positive. And so, all of the pictures that you see of the shroud are, of course, negatives of the shroud, because the shroud itself is a negative. So when you take a negative of the negative, you get the positive on the right, which is far more telling, right? It speaks far louder. It's far more visible. It's far more comprehensible, because, you guys some of you are probably too young to have ever actually seen a negative, right? Because everything's digital cameras. But if you're old enough to have taken pictures with actual film, of course, what you get back from the processor is the negative as well as the positive, because what's in the camera is the negative. And so it looks like, the image on the left. And, the dark is light and the light is dark. So the whole premise of the shroud being a fake supposes that somebody in the Middle Ages, when they wanted to fake the image of the shroud, decided to fake the negative of the image of Jesus on the shroud rather than the positive. A negative which was extremely hard to understand and wasn't very compelling until 700 years later, when photography was discovered. And I think the first photographer's name was Pio, actually noticed that the negative that he took of the shroud was a positive image, and then it became the circulated image. So you have to buy that. Not only was it a fake, but it was a fake of a negative 700 years before negatives existed, and anyone could know what the purpose of a negative was. But anyway, back to Barrie.
We know that the first negative was created by, that's on record, was created by Nietzsche for Nietzsche, and I believe it was 1826. We know that photography is an invention at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and not a medieval invention.
Now, if it's not a photographic process, what's the disproof of the claim that it could be a painted image?
Well, you can't have a painting if there's no paint. It's as simple as that. And although a few particulates have been found on the shroud that are paint, they are few and far between. They do not comprise the image. They're sort of scattered randomly across the cloth. And you have to understand there are 52 documented occasions where artists were permitted to paint a replica of the shroud and then lay their replica onto the shroud to sanctify it, create a relic, if you will. And at that point in time, transference of a few particles of paint is not only expected, but if it weren't there, I would be questioning. So there are a few particles of paint that have been found on the shroud, but no more so in the image areas than in the non-image areas, sort of scattered randomly across. Our team was so well prepared that we had the spectral characteristics with us of every paint and pigment known to man from medieval to modern times. And, we went there looking for paint, obviously, as one of the things that part of the mystery we were trying to solve was, is this a painted object or not? Now, I always ask people, if you look at the quality of the scientists that were on our team, guys from all these wonderful laboratories, how long do you think it would take for them to have found paint on the shroud if it were painted? 30 minutes, an hour, 2 hours? It wouldn't have taken very long for us to find it covered with paint. And I stupidly, at the earliest stages, before we went to Turin, opened my mouth and said, give us 5 minutes, we'll find the paint and the brushstrokes, we'll come home. Well, it's 36 years later, and there's no paint or brushstrokes, and I'm still doing this because just all the things that I sort of thought that would easily dismiss this were ultimately dismissed themselves.
You mentioned in passing the hands, the hands folded over the.
Let me interrupt for a moment because I'm responding to the chat stream because I love that some of you guys are watching live. I want to reward you, so to speak. Oops, let me get me on. Oh, I know why. I'll get in the habit of doing that, right? About Barrie Schwortz's conversion. Notice what he said. He didn't say he doesn't believe. He said, I don't feel like God is calling me into the Catholic Church at this point. That is a history of Jews not converting or converting. Simone Weil is a very, very famous case. She was a philosopher of around World War II. Jews, this is one of the reasons, by the way, this is an aspect of my ministry, actually. It is an aspect of my ministry, which is to convince Jews that they don't stop being Jewish when they enter the church. Because no Jew wants to stop being Jewish, and I think no Jew is able to stop being Jewish in his heart. So if you were to say, become a Catholic, that would be like saying, become an elephant or something. I'm a Jew, I'm not a Catholic. How can I become a Catholic? It's like telling me I have to become an antelope or an elephant or something. If you say, no, the church is composed of Jews and Gentiles. So become a Jew in the church rather than being a Jew outside of the church. You're not becoming a Gentile in the church. You're becoming a Jew in the church. It makes it a lot easier. And that is a part of my shtick, so to speak. So I do think that Barrie has faith. I think that Barrie believes, I know that he believes that the shroud is a miraculously produced image of Jesus. And if Jesus was a nobody, why would God have produced this miraculous image of him? Obviously, he believes, but he doesn't feel called to be Catholic. He still feels like he's supposed to be a Jew. So anyway, if you want to understand Jewish conversion, there's no reason really for you to want to understand Jewish conversion. But if you want to understand Jewish conversion, you have to be conscious that it's not just a matter of what you think the truth is about Jesus. There's another dimension to it, which is who you feel you are and what transition you feel capable of making and what transition you feel God is calling you to make. And throughout history, there have been Jews who are completely convinced of the truth of the Catholic Church and have not, nonetheless, they've wanted to die as a Jew. Sometimes they may have actually entered the Catholic Church kind of on their deathbed. There's some famous cases of that also. But Simone Weil died at the time of the Holocaust, and she did not want to separate herself from the Jewish people by becoming Catholic. I much prefer what Edith Stein did, of course, which was she died as a Jew in the Catholic Church during the Holocaust. Anyway, sorry, this isn't about me and Jewish conversion and Barrie Schwortz personally. It's about the Shroud of Turin. So let's go back to the Shroud of Turin.
There's no paint or brushstrokes, and I'm still doing this because just all the things that
I don't know where I stopped, so let me go back a little.
Part of the mystery we were trying to solve was, is this a painted object or not? Now, I always ask people, if you look at the quality of the scientists that were on our team, guys from all these wonderful laboratories, how long do you think it would take for them to have found paint on the shroud if it were painted? 30 minutes, an hour, 2 hours? It wouldn't have taken very long for us to find it covered with paint. And I stupidly, at the earliest stages, before we went to Turin, opened my mouth and said, oh, give us 5 minutes, we'll find the paint and the brushstrokes, we'll come home. Well, it's 36 years later, and there's no paint or brushstrokes. And I'm still doing this because just all the things that I sort of thought that would easily dismiss this were ultimately dismissed themselves.
You mentioned in passing the hands, the hands folded over the middle of the image and a single nail, presumably exit wound in one wrist. So that means the nails went through the wrists?
Well, the Greek word for hand doesn't distinguish between the dead center of the palm and 1 inch closer to the wrist, which I always do this demonstration in my lectures. If you take your thumb and your little finger and you put them together, you look at the two fleshy parts of the palm, and there's like a groove that runs down between those two fleshy parts called the thenar furrow. And if you have to nail 100 people to a cross today, you're going to find the quickest, simplest way of getting a good purchase on where you're going to drive that nail by putting the little finger and thumb together, creating that thenar furrow, putting the nail there, and hammering it through. It's much more difficult for somebody to rip their hand loose than if it's an inch toward the center of the palm where the phalanges are, where it might be easy for a strong man to rip himself loose while he's being tortured. So the Romans knew how to do this, and although we can only see the exit wound at the back of the hand, the exit wound is consistent with the nail going through that fleshy part of the palm, but it's still the palm. So
if I understand correctly, what you're saying in part is it would only be rational for the exit wound to be through the wrist because it makes a more secure purchase. It basically nails the victim much more securely.
Wherever when this nail was driven through, it would not have broken any of the bones of the hand. It would have gone through without doing so. But those bones would have served to fasten that hand very tightly to the cross so that the man couldn't tear his hand loose.
Okay, the number one,
Okay, so here we have that picture there. So, skeptics again, I don't have to go on and on and on. So what Barrie was actually pointing out is that if you hammered the nail through here. And this is the palm, right? If you started the nail here as the entrance wound, this picture, of course, is of the exit wound, and at the right angles to go under the bone so that the bone would help keep the weight of the body from falling off the cross. It'll exit, it'll exit here. It'll exit what looks like the wrist. It actually, I don't want to say it isn't the wrist. I don't know, what to call that. But would it exit, I think here. I think I actually feel the bones through which it would exit. And I can feel that those bones are pretty substantial bones there. You can do this too, actually. Why don't we have a little show and tell here? So you fold the palm of your hand, and you drive the nail through here. Don't do it with real nails, folks. Please don't do this. Try this yourself at home. But you drive the nail through here, and imagine like at a 45-degree angle or something, and it would come out here. This is the sweet spot. I can feel the indentation here, and which is in between a bunch of bones. I mean, anyway. And by the way, I don't know if this counts for being kosher, but that they didn't break the legs of Jesus on the cross, so that scripture would be fulfilled, not a bone of his shall be broken, which was a requirement for the Passover lamb. So they did not break a bone in his hand either. So that not a bone of his shall be broken, so that scripture would be fulfilled properly, because Jesus was the true Passover lamb. But if I start talking about that, we'll never get to the end. I don't think we'll get to the end anyway. But since I'm talking about the nailing of the hand, let me and I've also been talking. I mean, the whole point of the show is it's got 2 points. I think you figured this out by now. One of those points is debunking the debunking of the shroud and showing that anyone with goodwill has to accept it as legitimately the shroud of that Jesus was wrapped in, and therefore that Jesus was someone very, very special. But the other reason is to just bring home the reality of what Jesus suffered for us. So in that light, let me make use of Mel Gibson again. Wow. Okay. Mel was pretty historically correct there. Wow. Kind of hard to come back after that. There's a little bit of a juncture in the show. We're going to start with carbon-14 dating, which is a really big deal, of course, because that's the main debunking of the shroud, the main contradiction of the truth of the shroud. I am going to start part 2 now.
Tu chi dormi in sta pietra scolpita, dove